Good morning. I would like to welcome you all again to TII's 6th Annual International Translation Conference. If you were here yesterday, I hope you enjoyed the keynote, the 3 academic panels, and the 2 seminars we had. Today, we still have a keynote, 2 academic panels, and 4 workshops organized by TII's Professional Services Center. As I mentioned in my opening remarks yesterday, that this year's theme, Translating the Gulf Beyond Fault Lines, is an attempt to capture the competencies and cultural identities that are represented in the Gulf through academic presentations and seminars that stand at the intersections of different fields and translation studies. This may be the last time I talk to you all, so I would like to acknowledge my team, whose hard work and dedication were behind the success of this year's conference. The logistic team, who communicated with you, did your booking, booked the venue, event management and all. Head of the logistic team, Fatma Atauna. Fatma Haddad, Communication, Mirna Al-Khansa, Events, Jihad Saber, Operations, helping him Javika Shetty, Haytham Musa, IT, Ren Atrash, helping everyone, from Professional Services, Delphine Deloisy, and helping her, Hadil Abu Hamid. I'd like to also thank the scientific committee who selected the panelists and who will communicate with the panelists very soon regarding publishing their papers in a peer-reviewed special edition of Q Science. The head of the committee is Dr. Salah Basalama, Dr. Jazilia Neves, Dr. Tariq Shamma, Dr. Sue Ann Harding, and Dr. Avidi Carbonell Cortez, who was a visiting distinguished professor in TII last semester. Finally, I would like to urge you all in filling the survey that you should have in your files. Your feedback means a lot to us. Now, I'm very delighted to introduce our keynote speaker today, Dr. Danielle Newman. Professor Newman is a professor of Arabic, head of the Arabic department, and course director of the MA in Arabic English Translation and Interpreting at the University of Durham, UK. In addition to translation and linguistics, his research has centered on Arabic geographical and travel literature, with special focus on Arab travelers to Europe in the 19th century, as well as the Nahda movements, on which he has published extensively. In 2009, he was the co-recipient of the World Award of the President of the Republic of Tunisia for Islamic Studies for the book entitled Muslim Women in Law and Society. His works in the field of translation include An Imam in Paris, Arabic-English Thematic Lexicon, Modern Arabic Short Stories, a bilingual reader, and an A to Z of Arabic-English-Arabic translation. His forthcoming publications include Arabic-English-Arabic translation issues and strategies, and Rifa' al-Tahtawi, a 19th century Egyptian educationalist and reformer. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Newman to the stage.
Good morning, everybody. Today I propose to take a trip down memory lane, translation memory lane, and talk about a much underexplored era in Arabic translation, the 19th century. Now, within translation studies, Arabic translation theories have consistently been ignored. If you read any book on the history of translation theory, you will be hard put to find any references to Arab theories. The implication somehow being that translation theory was non-existent. Of course, it wasn't, and not least because in the history of Arab Islamic culture, there have been 2 massive translation movements. The first, of course, during the Abbasid period, when almost all secular, non-religious literature from Greek was translated into Arabic. almost all. In fact, the movement, which came to an end in the 12th century, stopped very abruptly for the very simple reason that everything had been translated. And within this translation movement, of course, we have the famous Hunayn ibn Ishaq, who was a Syriac-speaking Christian, translating into Arabic, into Syriac, or between them from Greek. He set up what can be called the very first school of translators. According to Ibn Nadim, who wrote his famous Fihris, about 70 translators were active in that period. And Hunayn himself, in addition to his son, his nephew, and so on. We also have the great Al-Jahiz, who also wrote on translation, particularly with regard to poetry, and then Es-Sijistani Safadi, who also had a number of things to say about translation and how to proceed. And I'd like to quickly, because it's not the topic of our discussion today, I'd like to quickly take a look at some of the rather revolutionary things that Hunayn had to say about his duties. Hunayn is exceptional in so many ways, but relevant to our discussion today is the fact that he wrote what is in effect a translator's biography in the shape of a letter, in which he explains his methodology. And the two passages here refer to, in the first one, a translation from Greek by the great physician Galen. Hunayn translated most of Galen's work into Syriac. And what I'd like to draw your attention to is how he proceeded. So when he says, there were some things, there was a quote by Aristophanes, the Greek playwright, in Galen's work, and he states that he makes a reference to a difference in register and lexis by stating that I'm familiar with the medical style of Galen, but not so much with the literary style of Aristophanes. And he then simply says that he omitted some of these, or compressed rather the passages, simply condensing the meaning. The second passage, so here we have meaning for meaning, that's the first one. The second passage is equally important, because here we have somebody who realized the importance of establishing a reliable source text. And so what he says here is that I found this text, but there were a lot of mistakes in it. So I then collected other manuscripts of the same text and arrived at, in effect, an editio princeps, as we say, of the source text, which would then allow him to produce a better translation, of course, without the corruptions. The third thing worth mentioning here is the translator constantly revising his work, constantly editing his work. And here he's very honest. He says, well, you know, when I was a young man, I translated something, but I'm now much older and wiser and more experienced, and I can now do a better job. So those three factors are quite important in terms of general translation methodology. Because the idea that somehow there was no theory, that Arabs had no theory, that somehow we have to look at the texts and that we have to proceed inductively, I think is a fallacy that has been perpetuated rather erroneously. And here we have a famous passage by Safadi himself, not a translator, but somebody who reported on what apparently was an established view on translation. And here we have two views on translation. So in the first one, he talks about the school of Yohanna bin al-Batriq, and the second one, of course, of our friend Hunayn. Essentially, it refers to what has become the standard debate in translation studies. Do we go for word meaning for meaning. And so here we have, in fact, the very first reference to this theoretical binary of translation approach. But today, of course, it's about the Nahda. And when we talk about the Nahda, it is, of course, primarily associated with the Arab world, and more specifically, Egypt. Convention has it that it was set off by a Frenchman, Napoleon, invading Egypt, 1798, and that somehow he woke everybody up, and that therefore we can mark that as the beginning of the modern Middle East. There's a number of things wrong with this view. Firstly, it implies that the Arab world was indeed asleep and needed to be woken up. Secondly, it also implies that in the long 19th century, and indeed the Nahda is commonly associated with the 19th century, but some people argue that in fact it went on beyond, and on the far end of the scale, there are people who claim that the Nahda is still going on. Now that, of course, is a more philosophical debate I don't propose to enter into today. When it comes to translation, however, the other misconception is that it has focused on Egypt. And once again, this skews the picture of what was going on in the Middle East in general and what was going on in terms of translation. In fact, if you look at the various regions, you find that there are a number of similarities, and that we can talk of a translation movement, not just in Egypt, but also in Turkey and Iran. These translation movements, Turkey and Iran, have barely received any attention. In fact, even the translation movement in Egypt has received scant attention. Yes, there's still the famous books by Shayal, Jalaluddin, there's Al-Jundi, and in European languages, there has been attention to specific figures, Rifat Tahtawi being one of them, but nobody has actually looked at the whole movement from a translation perspective, from a textual perspective. And that, in fact, is, I think, the most interesting aspect of the entire movement. It is, what do the translators have to say? Once again, it is somehow taken for granted that translators didn't have anything to say, that you had these people that were basically trained, they were craftsmen, and they just set about translating without paying any heed to methodology or introspective practice. As we shall see, that is patently untrue. The other thing that I'd like to raise today are the contacts between the various linguistic communities in terms of translation. Now, these three have a number of things in common. Firstly, translation began in all cases as a government-sponsored project. In Iran, it stayed that way up until the late 19th century. In Turkey and Egypt, this changed in the 1860s with the proliferation of printing presses and the concomitant creation of a new reading public because of education, eager for new literature. Secondly, initially the focus was on military affairs. In all cases, the rulers had suffered the effects of a European military might, and of course what they were most interested in initially was to improve their military. And so for that purpose, they trained new cadres, and of course they needed textbooks. And so there was a translation movement from predominantly French military manuals, but also Turkish manuals. Secondly, the source language in all three cases tended to be French. This changed only towards the end of the century when English started to become more important. And of course, this has continued to be the case in the 20th century and the 21st. Another interesting feature that one can observe is that a number of source texts were translated in all three languages. Sometimes directly from the source language, French, on other occasions indirectly through a relay language, which could either be Turkish or Arabic. So you have, for instance, translators in Egypt translating European books from Turkish that have been translated into Turkish into Arabic. Then you have translators in Turkey that are translating European manuals that have been translated into Arabic into Turkish. And then Iran joins the party, and they, in fact, borrow from both languages. In case you're wondering, of course, at the time, educated people spoke the three languages: Ottoman Turkish, Persian, and Arabic. So there was a great deal of interaction between those areas. The next factor, the role of European expatriates, many of whom got directly involved in translation. In Egypt, of course, we have the famous Claude Bey. In Iran, you have an Austrian doctor, Polak, and in Turkey, you have a variety of people who originally went there in order to teach, to assist the rules with their modernization programs, and then ended up acquiring the language. In Turkey, of course, we have James Redhouse, the great Ottomanist. Translation both mediated Western modernity, but also initiated it, in the sense that we went from translatio to emilatio to creation. And it is through the translations which then became models for local scholars and authors to emulate. Creation of a new reading public, I've already mentioned, as with the translation driven by the private sector. And then, of course, we have a proliferation of works. What also changes towards the end of the century is that we move away from technology, we move away from military affairs, and we then go into the realm of popular literature. And in the final quarter of the century, that constitutes the main body of source texts. And finally, of course, there's a fact that in all these countries, the development, the translation movement, continued until the present day. Periods. Quite a few scholars have attempted to set up tentative periods within the translation movement, and here I have a few. 1822 marks the establishment of the famous Bulaq press in Cairo, or rather the district of Bulaq, by Muhammad Ali Pasha. 1842, because then we have a translation school, of which more later. Then we have the activities of the graduates of the translation school and language school in Egypt. And then 1860s, we have the, if you like, literary translation movement that starts. Anwar al-Jundi adopts a slightly different chronology. He calls the first one, which is roughly the period coinciding with Rifat Tahtawi, as the scholarly phase. The next one he calls the perverted phase, munharifa. Why? Because he felt that the literature became frivolous, the translations became sloppy. And then the third phase is one where there is, according to al-Jundi, there is a return to scholarly, more serious work. Again, there's a problem because this kind of division cannot in any way be borne out by chronology. In fact, if anything, these three phases sometimes either coexisted or overlapped. Now, the beginnings. Well, the beginnings, in fact, even go back to a time prior to the introduction of printing. And in Damietta, in the 1810s, there was a Syrian immigrant by the name of Basil or Basili Fakr, who acted as the French consul. And he had gathered around him a few people who translated European works. And the titles are quite revealing. Les Aventures de Télémaque by Fénelon, and of course Bélisaire. Now those of you who may know these two works, Fénelon's Les Aventures de Télémaque is, of course, one of those mirror for princes. It's all about the advice to the crown prince, how to be a good king, and all the rest of it. And the format is that, of course, of Telemachus, the famous son of Ulysses from the Iliad. Bélisaire is about a Roman general, but it contains very clear references to the relationship between the ruler and his faithful subjects, and how rulers need to reward loyalty and don't. In fact, this was a rather controversial book when it first appeared and was banned for obvious reasons. So, as I said, science was the name of the game in that early period. And we step forward because, incidentally, the Damietta group, they translated, so these more philosophical works, but also technical works. Unfortunately, they were never printed, and very few of them have survived. The main person there was a Greek Catholic called Isa Boutros, or Isa Petro, who originally hailed from Jerusalem and found himself there translating. The problem was that he could only translate from Greek. So some of the works had to be translated first into Greek, and then he would translate into Arabic, rather badly, it has to be said. Then for a while there is nothing. So as far as the rest of the country was concerned, they were all blissfully ignorant of these first attempts. And there is no reference in any of the contemporary literature about these translation activities. In terms of circulation, we know very little about how many people read this, who was the intended target readership, and so on. Then the next important stage is the military. So Muhammad Ali Pasha sets up a school in the citadel in Cairo, and they need some textbooks, they translate some manuals, but the translation movement in terms of military affairs was rather modest for a very obvious reason. The school was intended for officers, and the officers were all Turkish-speaking. So they used, of course, Turkish manuals. It is only afterwards that those Turkish manuals would be translated into Arabic. When it comes to medicine, we have the French doctor, Claude Bay, who arrives in the mid-1820s, becomes the main military doctor, sets up a hospital, which of course eventually became the Qasr al-Aini Hospital in Cairo, which is still there, though in a different location. And in the school, he realizes the importance of having textbooks in the original language, because the way in which everybody taught, you had foreigners, the teachers were all foreigners, Italians and Frenchmen, and they would teach, they would have an interpreter next to them. The interpreter would translate, the students would hopefully understand. Questions would be put to the interpreter, who would then translate for the teacher, who would hopefully understand. And that was the way classes were run, but of course not a very effective way at all. So we have the start there of a movement aided and abetted by the establishment of a press. So there was both Boulaq and the medical school. Afterwards, Claude Bay also sent people for training to France, and so he had the added advantage that the people who returned were not only translators, but they were doctors, so they were very familiar with the terminology and didn't need extensive editing. Technology, of course, was the other thing, and that came a little bit late. And by technology, I mean anything that Muhammad Ali was interested in. In fact, one of the very first books printed at the Bulaq press, the very first one was an Italian-Arabic dictionary by a Melkite priest, another Syrian immigrant, called Zahur. And Zahur also produced the second book, which was a translation on dyeing, because Muhammad Ali had set up a textile plant, and of course he needed to know how to operate things. In all cases, and there you have the medical school 1827, the Polytechnical School, Muhandis Khana, where you had the leading light, Muhammad al-Bayoumi, who was also trained in Paris. And so those two are, in effect, translation powerhouses. The medical school, for instance, they print no fewer than 50 books, some of them quite voluminous, over a decade and a half. The same thing is true for the Polytechnical School. The Muhandis Khana also had its own little press. So in all cases, the aim was clearly pedagogic, didactic. When it comes to source languages, there's only one known translation from Italian into Arabic. It's also the very first one by this gentleman here, Yohanna Anhouri, who was also, as his name indicates, of course, a Syrian immigrant. And you have there the text by Berlingueri's medical manual. Yusuf Firaun was another important one. Bayoumi I've already mentioned. Now, Anhouri was at the cradle of the translation movement. He was a Syrian, didn't know French. So once again, books had to be translated into Italian before he could translate them. It was in order to bridge that gap, of course, that Muhammad Ali, in 1826, sent his very famous student mission, 42 people, to Paris, and one of them, whose name has already been mentioned, returned and would become the undisputed leader of the translation movement. I know I've got you on the edge of your chair now. Who is this man? We'll get to that in a second. The other important element when we talk about foreign influences are the missionaries. And the missionaries played a crucial role. This is the first page of Anhouri's first book. It's a translation of a French medical manual. So the clear speech, قول صريح في علم التشريح, on, of course, anatomy. Now, in terms of methodology, the first thing we need to mention is that there was a great deal of adaptation. So these were not literal translations. Also, the text was tends to be couched in a very extensive introduction. The introduction would involve a general introduction to the modern sciences in Europe, and then move on to the science discussed in the book. There would always be references to the leader, Muhammad Ali Pasha, thanking him for the glorious light that he shone on Egypt, and so on. So we're talking about adaptation, compilation. Remember the pedagogic, the didactic aim. These were intended to be textbooks. Terminology, of course, was a particular problem, and one that they resolved as best they could. And we can also detect a development there. Initially, the terminology was rather clumsy, a lot of borrowing, but as the years went on, and also as the practice of having not one but sometimes two translators as well as an editor, the Arabic, of course, improved, and also the practice, the terminological or terminology creation practice improved. There was limited acculturation in the sense that, of course, within technology it's very difficult to Egyptianize, unlike in literature, where, of course, as we'll see, that becomes the main factor. Checks and balances. So, as I said, several translators, even the great Rifat Tahtawi, there I've mentioned his name, he would translate, even his work would be read and would be post-edited. Interestingly enough, in the early period, the translators tended to be the Syrian Christians, and the revisers tended to be sheikhs from Al-Azhar. So very early on, there was even in that sense, a very telling way of looking at language and trying to aim for a language that was as pure and as accurate as possible. So, Egypt, education, and then from the mid-1830s, we have the social sciences. Social sciences, we're talking about economics, we're talking about political economics in particular, we're talking about history, all of those things that provide a much broader view of what European modernity was supposed to imply. Crossing borders, I've already mentioned, of course, Turkey and Iran, but also in Tunisia. Tunisia, under the ruler Ahmed Bey, who was very much impressed and looked up to Muhammad Ali Pasha, he also set up a military school in the Bardo Palace, for which a total of some 50 works were translated into Arabic. This was continued by the great Khaireddin Pasha, who would, in fact, extend the translation movement when he set up the famous Sadiqi school, the Madrasa al-Sadiqiyya. The missionaries, they were very active. I'll skim this bit. Suffice it to say that there were several missionary groups, both English Protestants and American Protestants, in addition to the Jesuits. The Jesuits, of course, were everywhere. And they entered into a kind of translation race. The people that won initially were the English. Through the Church Missionary Society, they set up a press in Malta and started producing books. And there you have some of the titles. Very significant here: Pilgrim's Progress, and of course, Robinson Crusoe. Why are these titles significant? Because anybody here who's read those books, or either one of them, these are, of course, steeped in very rigid Christian Protestant tradition and a view of the world. And so these were printed, these had been translated primarily, in fact, solely for the aim of conversion. That was the aim, and I've got a little quote there, which is from a direct quote from the Church Mission, CMS Atlas. It says, "To overthrow any other form of worship with which it," the CMS, "is brought into contact." You can't get any clearer than that. Unfortunately for them, they weren't very successful because nobody really cared to read these books, except they were preaching in a way to the converted. We have Petro, again, who does Pilgrim's Progress. The translation is considered so bad that it is later on redone by the great Al-Bustani. Robinson Crusoe, we have a Shidyaq. And once again, Al-Bustani, of course, those who know a little bit about the history, Al-Bustani and Shidyaq were not the closest of friends. Al-Bustani, of course, couldn't resist saying that the Shidyaq's version was rubbish, and he needed a new one, and so 10 years later, there was another one. So, the protagonists, Rifat Tahtawi, Faris al-Shidyaq, and one that I haven't mentioned, Muhammad Uthman Jalal, who worked in Egypt and translated, was a specialist in French drama, tragedy, and so on. Translated Molière, Racine, and so on. And here we have, this is Jalal Tahtawi, and this is an elderly Faris al-Shidyaq. Here we have the frontispiece of the very first edition of Qissat Robinson Crusoe. And and as you can see there, the date, 1835, in Malta. Incidentally, Shidyaq was a rather interesting fellow, as you all know, born in Lebanon as a Maronite, became a Protestant, like his brother. His brother was then tortured by the Maronites, killed. He then converted to Protestantism in Malta, which is why he was reeled in to do the translation. He also translated some religious literature, but he already had some Islamic or Muslim tendencies because, as we shall see, he infused even some Christian religious works with sly Muslim references. Eventually, Eshediaq would become a Muslim officially in 1860 when he went to Tunisia. And then, of course, gained his moniker Ahmed Faris Eshediaq. Incidentally, of course, his Christian origins, of course, were never hidden very well in his surname Eshediaq. Here we have the very first translation of a European literary work, European poetry. This is by Rifat Tahtawi, which was a translation of his compatriot's diwan, La Lyre Brisée by Joseph Agoub, whose family had collaborated with the French and had fled with the returning French army. Now, the translation techniques that are commonly mentioned in this respect, of course, are, is it faithful versus literal, natural versus alienation, foreignization, domestication, covert versus overt, visible, invisible, all these buzzwords which, frankly, do not serve our purpose. Why not? Because often, as with most things in life, things are never really cut and dried, and we are often dealing with a more complex picture. Now, in terms of typology, we have to distinguish between two types, literary texts and technical texts. Literary translation, firstly, also didactic. Literature was seen as history. So when somebody is translating Molière, oh, that's the way things were. When they translate Sir Walter Scott, that's history. That's the first thing. Secondly, the use of the colloquial, Amiya, also makes its entrance because obviously up until that time, Amiya was considered to be inferior to Fusha. Translations were done both in prose and verse, with Saja, rhymed prose, being a particular favorite. And then the content was also adapted stroke accultured with the changing of names, cultural references, religious references, and often there was a dissonance between reference to quintessentially European context, but dressed up in Arab local dress. Stylistic devices, also the use of preambles. So the translator would become very visible by introducing the text, by introducing the characters, contextualizing it, again, very mindful of that idea of educating the reader. In so doing, of course, sacrifices had to be made, choices had to be made, and the choices they made were either to amplify where they saw fit, to compress, or simply to omit, just like Hunayn. Exegetic translation in the sense of commentaries, footnotes, as we shall see, in order to explain certain concepts for which they couldn't find a ready equivalent. Now, we've talked about the texts. Now, it's what some of these authors, in fact, there's more than just these two that had something to say about a translation, but let's take a look at these. So, the first passage refers to choosing words in order to suit the meaning of the original without making unnecessary changes. And also referring to the fact that, and this is crucial, unfortunately it's not there, I was ready with my laser to point it out to you, is that he states this is a technique that is used very often, that is common in translation. What does that tell us? This, incidentally, is in the introduction to Tahtawi's translation of Fénelon's Télémaque, published in 1867, but completed much earlier, published incidentally not in Egypt, but in Beirut, because, of course, he was too scared to print it in Cairo. So this means that by the mid-19th century, there was a commonly accepted view of translation methodology. This is the common way in which it is done in translation. The other passage here is also quite significant, where he talks about shaping it, molding the translation in compliance with the temperament misage. مزاج اللغة العربية, but in a different literary form, inserting proverbs, حكم, wisdom, counsels of wisdom. And then he uses this wonderful phrase, weave ansaj. I should weave it differently in a style that may be inferior or superior to that of the source, so that the translation became only an approximation, taqrib. However, I decided it would be more appropriate to keep the original form and cast away any doubt. Note that word doubt. As anybody who translates is well aware, doubt is the devil of the translator. Here we have Jalal, who also in a collection, Riwayat al-Mufida fi Ilm al-Trajida, I followed the poetic form of the original, rendered it so that the general public would understand. The colloquial language, اللغة دارجة, is the most appropriate for this purpose and the best at reaching the souls of the elite and commoners alike. Again here, we have a crucial thing, the choice of the colloquial, not a coincidence, but part of a very clear framework. Lexical innovation, of course, was another key area in which translation played a crucial, not to say the most important role. And I already hinted at the technical translations earlier on the century. So first we went from borrowing and then on to coining neologisms. It's also, incidentally, in the 19th century, in the latter half thereof, that we see the very first efforts towards the establishment of an Arabic language academy. They failed for various reasons. The usual reason, of course, since somebody sets up a little group, they start inventing terms. Another group gets together and says, that's rubbish, these are the correct translations. And then a third group says, well, no, these two are wrong, and so on and so forth, which in fact, in a way, continued or has continued to the present day with the Arabic language academies. Beginnings of standardization, therefore, also in the 19th century. And then technical translation is the second type. And here, the approach is rather different. So there's a combination of Muslim scientific heritage and European modernity. Remember, I started off by referring to some misconceptions that the Arab world was asleep and so on. It wasn't asleep. And of course, in Arabic literature also, it's referred to the age of decline, asl inhitat. Yes, there was decline if you compare it to the Abbasids, but the idea that somehow everybody was asleep waiting for a Frenchman to wake them up is rather silly. And in technical translation, we can actually see some proof of that. The Arab Muslim heritage was not forgotten. And if you read the translation, you find numerous references, for instance, to terms coined by the great Hunayn, which reappear in translations of, say, mathematics, medicine, and so on. Even Ibn Sina makes an appearance. The register of these technical translations is also very specific. It tends to be classical with some colloquial influence. Colloquial influences are quite limited, never in terms of vocabulary, but more in terms of syntax, so rather limited. Paraphrases, very common. And the syntax, and here we have really the start of modern Arabic technical language, very simplified. So we do away with the complex hyperstructures of classical Arabic, and here we have short sentences delivered in very clear language. And we can clearly see the influence of Rifat Tahtawi, who in his famous Takhlis al-Ibris wrote something which is quite prophetic, and we can see how it was applied to the translations. And he's talking about the French books. So firstly, he talks about how Arabic books are difficult to understand. You need commentaries, super commentaries, and so on. And he says, the French, their books, rarely have commentaries, annotations, or glosses. You might add a few brief notes, but the texts themselves are enough to enable one straight away to understand to what they refer. Whenever one starts reading a book on any science, one can apply one's entire mind to understanding the issues, concepts, and rules of the science without having to mull over the terms used. And it is clear that he really did apply what he preached in his subsequent activities. Some examples, if I have time. And we're going to take a look here. This is from Robinson Crusoe. And what is quite interesting, this is Faris Shidiak, whose name, incidentally, is never mentioned. There is proof in the shape of records, and reference is made to Faris Shidiak doing the translation, but his name is never mentioned in the text. But there's a lot of Shidiakisms, if you're familiar with his language. Let's take a look at some of the changes he made. Remember, this is a Shidiak who's still firmly a Protestant. And he's working for the Protestants, so he's a fully paid up member of the community. Now, in the original of Robinson Crusoe, when he sort of, arrives on the island and all the rest of it, and he looks out, and then what he says, a very sort of typically Protestant view, biblical view, that I was king and lord of this country indefensibly and had a right of possession, and I could convey it. I might have it in inheritance completely as any lord of a manor in England. In the Arabic text, there is no mention of this. The Arabic text simply says, he's looking at a garden. And of course, the idea being that nature does not belong to man. Nature belongs to God. And Shidiak takes out that reference. Here we have another telling example. Robinson Crusoe's friends, one of his friends, before he meets up with the Good Friday, is the captain. Again, those who read the book will remember that the captain's name is never given. Now, in the original, it said, and my friend, to my great misfortune, dying soon after his arrival, and then the sentence continues. We blah, blah, blah. Shidiak, no. Shidiak really naturalizes it, acculturates that text, because it is rather a moving passage. He cannot bring himself to gloss over the death of a friend like that. This goes against his cultural grain, the very heart of his being. A few days after we arrived in London, the captain became gravely ill and died quickly afterwards. And when I heard the bad news, pain and sadness clouded upon me, and from an excess of grief I swallowed my fate and said, I am God's, and to him do we all return. Now, of course, this is a clear Quranic reference, Surah Al-Baqarah. So here we have a wonderful example how Shidiak clearly wasn't a fully paid up member. Shidiak was pretending, and it's very interesting because this informs us to a wonderful degree about his psychology at the time. Incidentally, after he left Malta, he went to Egypt where he worked for Al-Waqa al-Masriya, and then in 1848 he went to England where he produced the very first Arabic Bible translation. So he continued, but then such is life, one has to be pragmatic, I guess. It was a living. We've all translated things that we weren't fully in favor. But so please kindly note, amplification here, cultural acculturation, if you will, and also religious references. And then here we have another interesting case where he naturalizes the text. So the original says, there was a savage and he came close and there was something like a hair hanging over him. And so, Yashbah al-Arnab, so far so good. But then Shidiak, that's not good enough. So he continues and I think it was al-Mariri. Now, al-Mariri is a bird. Why he should put in the bird, but what is incidentally significant is that the bird, of course, is endemic to the Middle East. So he geographically relocates, recites the source text into the source language culture, which is quite extraordinary and unique in Arabic literature. Here we have another example which I've chosen because of this bit, the note. Now, in the original, it talks about cannibals. And of course, cannibals, that's a tricky one. How do you translate that? And Shidiak, he put there, this is the reference, Ghilan. But of course, that doesn't really tell the Arabic reader anything. So he goes on, the Ghilan, those are people who eat human flesh. And he goes